Section 7.3, the multiplier dot, also known as the augmentation dot. So this is a symbol that you have seen a little bit of in both Snow Goose and Coot, I believe, by this point. And this is a little dot that appears after a note or after a rest. So for instance, if you have a quarter note on its own, it looks like that. And when you have this little dot after it, it'll look like that. If you have a quarter rest on its own, it looks like that. And then the dot after it, it will appear like that. And all that means is that you're going to multiply the value of that symbol, whether it's a note or rest, by 1.5. So let's take many examples, actually, before we look at these over here. So you remember probably the hierarchy of our notes that we've learned thus far. We'll just focus on notes for right now. Leave the rests for the separate examples. Up here, we have a whole note, which is normally worth 4, half note normally worth 2, quarter note normally worth 1, and eighth note normally worth 0.5. Now, if we put a dot after a whole note, it's no longer going to be worth 4, but it's going to be worth 4 times 1.5, or 4 times 1.5. Well, 4 times 1.5 or 4 times 1.5 is going to give you 6. So believe it or not, a dotted whole note is going to get 6 beats. You could follow the same logic down here. A dotted half note. Well, if a regular half note gets 2, a dotted half note is going to get 2 times 1.5, which gives you 3. A quarter note on its own gets 1, but a dotted quarter note, 1 times 1.5, gives you 1.5. And then here, maybe the trickiest one of the bunch. An eighth note on its own is going to be 0.5, but when you take a dotted eighth note, it's going to be 0.5 times 1.5, or 0.5 times 1.5. You're going to wind up with 0.75 of a beat. And we'll get to what those notes sound like in another couple of chapters. But for right now, it's enough to know the math here. So let's go over to these examples as promised. Dotted half note, which means you take a regular half note, 2, multiply by 1.5. It indeed gives you 3. Dotted quarter note, as we just said, 1.5. Dotted whole note, as we saw in the diagram, is 6. Now here, check it out. It's a rest. That's an eighth rest, which you just learned. Put a dot after it. Its value is going to become then 0.75. So just like a dotted eighth note is 0.75, a dotted eighth rest is also 0.75 of the beat. And yes, this is just to clarify our phrasing here. Even though it looks as if from left to right we have quarter note and then a dot, we actually pronounce it dotted quarter note or dotted eighth note, dotted eighth rest, and so forth. So work through these equations. I might do 1 or 2 of them as demonstrations. So this is the same type of problem that you've had before, just with these dots mixed in. So let me take one that involves a dot. Let's do number 3 together. So looking at that symbol, well, that looks like a quarter rest, but it also has that little dot. These dots are pretty small, so you have to keep your eyes out for them. So a dotted quarter rest, well, a quarter rest would be 1, but a dotted quarter rest, multiply that by 1.5, it gives you 1.5. Here is just a regular old eighth note, so that's 0.5. So 1.5 plus 0.5 gives you an answer of 2. So that's how you work these out. Now, one other thing to mention, this is to clarify what I have in this paragraph. Because these dots, the augmentation dot, also known as a multiplier dot, because they extend a note's value by 50%, that's what multiplying by 1.5 does, and because the common note values are related by factors of 2. So for instance, up here, you notice that as we went down this chart here, these numbers are related by factors of 2. The process of putting a dot after a note is equivalent to tying that note to the next shortest note value. So for instance, here we have, and I'm going to work this out just below it, even though you see the full explanation above it. If we see a dotted half note, what that really means is that we're going to take a half note and extend it by an additional 50%. So here's our half note. Now going back up to that chart, here it is. What we're going to do is to tie that note to the next note down on this hierarchy. So we're going to tie a half note to a quarter note. Again, that's equivalent to putting the dot after it, which means that its value is going to be 2 for the half note combined with 1 for the quarter note, and that gives you 3. This one you can look at. I'll do one more example, and this is to give you a little taste of what you'll see in another couple of chapters. If you were to continue this hierarchy up here, logically you would come up with a 16th note as being next, and its value is going to be 0.25, again following that same pattern of getting smaller by a factor of 2 each time. So if you were to encounter a dotted 8th note, it would be equivalent to an 8th note, yes, tied to the next note down on that hierarchy, which is going to be that pesky 16th note, which we just introduced. So it's going to be the same thing as that, which means that it's also equivalent to 0.5 plus 0.25. Again, 0.25 is the value of the 16th note, as you'll learn in a few chapters, and that still gives you that same answer of 0.75. So that's just another way of looking at your augmentation dot, considering it as kind of like a tie.